Welcome. Give everyone just a second to get connected and get their audio on. Okay, wonderful. So welcome everybody. Good afternoon, early evening. Thank you so much for joining Bookhampton's virtual event with Scott Mitchell and Lyn Winter. They're in conversation today with Paul Goldberger. A few Zoom housekeeping details before we get started. You are all muted, and you will remain muted through the duration of this event. For optimal viewing, use Zoom view functions in the top right corner of your screen and select speaker view so that our author is highlighted on your screen. Please ask questions in the chat box function of your Zoom screen. We will get to as many questions as possible. Bookhampton's mission control, that's me, is monitoring the chat box, so send your questions there. If at any time you drop off the Zoom or experience technical difficulties, simply click the link again to be readmitted. And please don't forget to purchase a copy of Scott Mitchell's Houses at bookhampton.com or at rjjulia.com. I will leave links in the Zoom chat. And now, without further ado, let's get started. Scott Mitchell is an acclaimed architectural designer. He is celebrated for his warm, modernist approach to connecting the built and natural environment. Houses is the first volume that spotlights his work, featuring previously unpublished photographs of some of Scott's pivotal projects. Lyn Winter is the founder and president of Lyn Winter, Inc., a strategic communications and advisory agency specializing in contemporary art and visual culture. She is also Scott's editor, collaborating with him on his debut monograph. In conversation with Scott and Lyn this afternoon is Pulitzer-Prize winning architecture critic Paul Goldberger. And now I will leave the chat and open up the floor to Scott, Lyn, and Paul. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And thank you both Scott and Lyn for being here from Los Angeles today. I'll tell you, while virtual events are frustrating in some ways, they also are a wonderful opportunity in others because we get to have people from all over the country and all over the world joining together who might not be in the neighborhood to show up at the bookstore. So, and on balance, I think we come out very, very much ahead. This is an exceptionally beautiful book, and I'm actually going to hold up my copy, which, not the least of the reasons I like it, besides the fact that I very much like Scott's work, is that it's so wonderful to have an elaborate book about very meticulously designed houses that has a black and white cover, which strikes me as sort of a perfect symbol of the understatement that Scott's work has. It's not simple work, it's not plain work, but it's nevertheless beautifully restrained and controlled and disciplined. Let's start by talking just about the background, Scott, and how you developed the aesthetic that marks not only the cover of the book, but really more importantly, the work within it.
Yeah. Well, I jokingly said to Lyn started working with me about 7 or 8 years ago, and she was gung-ho to get started, and we've talked about this book for so many years, and she said, all right, when are we going to do the book? And I said, oh, give me another 7 or 8 years, because in architecture, of course, everything happens at a very slow pace. And
in book publishing, everything also happens at a very slow pace.
Yeah, and you compound the two together, and you know it's interminable. So at 49 and a half years of age, I finally got enough stuff to fill a book. It's a long road, but also hopefully a graceful profession to grow old in. I'm hoping, but my work is kind of informed, I think, largely, as for all of us, our experiences in life shape and kind of direct our path and our journey. And I think my aesthetic and my style of architecture was really influenced by the unique way that I grew up. My dad was a fighter pilot in the Air Force and the military attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan. And so I lived as a kid in Jordan and in Japan for 4.5 years. And it was really interesting to see, I think the Middle East part, my folks were so good about taking my sister and I to ruins on the weekends, and we'd have little hikes and picnics. And, in the Middle East, you can't throw a baseball without hitting something 5,000 years old. And there's something about the way ruins erode into the landscape that there's something poetic in that just got in my DNA, I think, as a kid. And there's something really romantic to me about the idea that something man builds can sort of be retaken by nature over time. And so a lot of the monolithic elements in my work, you'll see big concrete walls that are 3.5 feet thick and masonry. I think it kind of draws from that. I think it was influenced by that early on. And then I also really have a profound appreciation for wood and light, delicate use of materials, which I think was something that I picked up on with the Shinto architecture in Japan. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I guess it got in my blood and led me to where we are.
But there's also a lot of the modernist architecture tradition, which is important to your work, it seems to me, but not in an orthodox way or not in a dogmatic way. And it's woven together with other things. I mean, I think I've said to you before, one of the things I like best about it is that it seems both modern and connected to history at the same time. The sense that those two things are incompatible is not compatible with your way of looking at things, it seems.
Right. Yeah, you and I have spoken before about this interesting conundrum that we face in architecture today, because modernism has been around since the early 20th century, so it's more than 100 years old, and so by definition, modernity in architecture is antique, which is quite a paradox. So I've kind of come to the conclusion pedantically when I hear clients or people talking about architecture, they always want to use two terms, modern or traditional.
Right.
And I think what people really mean by that, this is my own observation, is either pitched roof or flat roof. Pitched roof is traditional and flat roof is modern. And so we kind of find ourselves at an interesting crossroads, I think, in terms of anything goes. The rule book on modern and traditional, the lines are very blurred now in a way that I think is pretty great.
Yes. Well, it's great if you can do work that synthesizes it as beautifully as a lot of your houses do, I think. It also there's a certain amount of confused, crappy work, but there always has been. So that's now let's go back to the history of your career, which is kind of interesting. You talked about growing up all around the world and about exposure to a lot of different kinds of culture. What was your exposure to modern architecture, though, which was not part of that upbringing? I know you spent a little bit of your early career working in Eastern Long Island, even though you spent most of it in LA.
Yeah. I mean, I have to confess, as a kid, I didn't really know what an architect was. And I started off in undergrad, actually in pre-med. And I think I was driven out eventually by the pain of biochemistry. But I went over to the College of Architecture and enrolled, and it just felt really like the right decision for me. And so ever since that second semester of my freshman year, I was kind of on this trajectory to become an architect, and really enjoyed it and have felt, right at home in that space. But I don't know how I really came to discover it. It makes sense looking back. I played with Legos a lot as a kid, but I don't know where the spark really, what the genesis of it really was.
Right. But then when you actually got your degree and began your career,
yeah,
you moved around a certain amount and were exposed to several people who were really key mentors, right?
That's right. Yes, I had a fabulous experience as a young architect. One of my first internships was on Long Island in the Hamptons, and I worked for Preston Phillips,
right,
who was a fabulous architect, modernist, that had come out of Paul Rudolph's office.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of Paul Rudolph's proteges, and Preston created this warm bath of an experience as a young man, because it was such a small office, and I was able to really learn a lot about the different facets. It's not like if you go to work for a big firm just out of undergrad, you might get stuck doing window details for.
I was about to say, you learn how to do doorknobs endlessly.
Exactly. So it was quite the opposite of that, and I had a very brief stint. Norman Foster offered me an internship in London, so I moved to London for a few months, actually before moving to Los Angeles. And
well, Norman Foster and Rudolph had a connection as well. So again, it's interesting because I really do see a little bit of a faint echo of Paul Rudolph in your work too. I mean,
that's interesting.
That sense of some very distant connection to Frank Lloyd Wright, but not direct, and a sense of just sort of composition being such a key part of your work as it was for Rudolph, who was so magnificent at simply composing elements and placing objects within space. That's something I very much feel in a lot of your houses. And the fact that both Preston Phillips and Norman Foster were very influenced by Rudolph means there's a kind of somewhere the DNA.
Yeah.
True. Yeah. So what took you to Los Angeles?
I wanted to go back to grad school, and I had been out for 4 or 5 years in between undergrad and graduate school. And I was in between the Architectural Association in London and SCIARC, Southern California Institute of Architecture here in Los Angeles. And I decided I wanted to go to SCIARC. And so I moved to Los Angeles in, I think, 1999. And started graduate studies there, and then just kind of stayed on in Los Angeles, and started to get hired to do jobs, and so lovingly I am stuck in Los Angeles, and actually feel very happy to be here. It's such a good time.
Well, it's in the years that you've been there, it's become an architectural community of enormous vibrancy and importance. Actually, really before you came, but it's been more and more so, and continues to grow in significance, it seems. But now, I think one of your important influences was somebody who was not an architect, but passionate and knowledgeable about design, which is Sandy Gallen.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit, and that can bring us back to the Hamptons and the work you've done here with him as well as in California.
Yeah. So, but my book is actually dedicated to Sandy, who we lost, and the book's also dedicated to my son Max, who came along just a matter of weeks after Sandy passed away. Mm-hmm. And Sandy was my best friend, and a very prominent sort of force in my life in terms of experience. I met Sandy when I was in the Hamptons, on the beach in East Hampton. And Sandy had a passion for interior design and design environments and creating these ambiances that were great for party throwing. And I mean, he's just kind of a legendary character. He really was never formally trained in the design world. He was a Hollywood guy, and
Right.
he was a manager of talent.
One of the sort of great amateur designers around, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and really kind of a taste influencer. He would do these houses, and even though he had managed the careers of Michael Jackson, Dolly Parton, Barbra Streisand, Bette Midler, just tons of people, even though that was really his career trajectory, at the same time along the way, he would do these houses for himself and then turn around, sell them furnished, soup to nuts, and would kind of move on and do the next one. Right. And I remember once asking him, sort of in a state of frustration, really, because we had just finished one and he was preparing to sell it already. I said, Sandy, how can you part with this? I mean, you know, and he said, Scott, I got to tell you something. The truth is, it's really like an addiction I have, buying all these beautiful antiques and these beautiful things. And so being able to kind of sell it and move on in a way validates my addiction, and it lets me kind of keep on and just do another one creatively. So really it was the creative process that I think turned him on. And I was at the receiving end of that as a young person. And Sandy's interest was really interior design. He was a brilliant decorator, brilliant. And I really was coming at it from more of an architectural perspective. And so we collaborated, and he hired me to do 9 houses for him. Mm-hmm. And so I was hired by him to function as an architect for 9 projects. Right. And during that time, we developed a very close friendship, and Sandy was an extraordinary sort of door opener for many of us. And so I kind of met a lot of the world's glitterati through Sandy. I wouldn't have met them otherwise. And so he was a really important kind of part of the path. Sure.
And you really collaborated on some of the most important work in the book, right?
Yeah. The 2 farm projects that are in the Hamptons, not far from Bookhampton and not far.
Well, one of them is right around the corner from my house. I've been looking lovingly at it all the time that you were doing it, and now that it's finished. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and that was the last house Sandy lived in, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And that was kind of a rich part of it, and several projects in the book. But I think perhaps most importantly is the lasting sort of imprint on my DNA in terms of the interiors. I think, Paul, that what makes a really great project, and I'm sure you will agree with me, it's the synthesis of not just the building, but also its contents and also the gardens. You know, they all really want to be in symphony with each other. And so Sandy Gallen really emboldened my appreciation for the interiors part.
You feel that very much in this book, which is, well, let me ask Lyn to tell us a little bit about how the book came to be, because it interests me primarily because Scott's work interests me, but also because it's a different take on the monograph. It really pulls you into the aesthetic more than most monographs do, with an enormous number of pictures, and some of them are not standard kind of pictures. They may be close-up details. Text is not the dominant thing. Maybe I shouldn't say that as a writer, but nevertheless, text is not the dominant thing. It has that wonderful restrained black and white cover I mentioned earlier. I mean, it's an unusual book in that way. Can you talk about how it came to be and took this form?
Yeah, absolutely. So I met Scott in 2013 at the Malibu house, which if you've seen the book is one of the 8 chapters.
Yeah.
And it's a magnificent property looking over the ocean. And it was the year that he just completed the design for Nobu, Malibu, which I think was an influence, very much so for this Malibu property. And, at the time, we talked about, whether at some point we'd be able to do a book. And, Scott explained to me that it was a very slow-moving profession and that, may have to wait a decade for enough, projects.
Well, as I said, so is publishing. So
yes, but it was a long journey. And, there were a number of projects in the works when we met. And I would say 2.5 years ago, we sat down together and it became clear that there was a significant body of work and there were relationships and themes and ideas that ran between early projects and more recent projects. And, it seemed to be the moment professionally for Scott to do the book, but equally there were personal reasons that I think came about, with regard to losing Sandy, his son being born, and there was a sort of a feeling of a sort of new era, one era ending and a new one beginning. Mm-hmm. So the book traces really a 20-year period from Scott setting up his studio, completing a number of projects, 8 of which are in the book, and they span East Coast, West Coast of the US, and an Australian project, and others in LA as well. And so it seemed to be the moment. And one of the things that I have found very interesting in Scott's work is his attention to material and form. And so what was very important when we decided to do the book was that it would really become an object, almost an object that would be a part of the buildings. And that's really, why I think the end result is so beautiful. I mean, Scott will tell you a little bit more, but we really went to great extent with colors and textures and every single thing in the book, and working with a great designer as well.
Yeah. That was very much my sense of this book, that it really comes closer than most books I've seen to trying to use the form of a book to replicate the experience of actually being in one of these houses. It is less a narrative about Scott's career. In fact, actually, I've learned a couple of things in this conversation that aren't in the book, and this is not a book that says I did this and then I did this and then I did that. It's a book in which the work really does speak for itself. And you feel through very, very sensual photography some of the feeling of actually being in these spaces, which is an unusual achievement in this kind of book, I think. And I have said a couple of times, I think that Scott's work is much more about feeling and experience than it is about any architectural dogma or theory. And the book follows that, it seems to me. The book itself is also about feeling and experience rather than a particular narrative story.
I mean, I have to say that the choice, Paul, of photographer or photographers was very important to all of us working on this. And, I think that we found an extraordinary photographer in Melbourne, Trevor Mine, who did, quite a few projects, has a beautiful sensibility and just really captured, Scott's kind of, creative vision and aesthetic. And obviously, Scott Francis has documented a number of projects. And then we even invited Ross Bleckner to take some photographs of the Hamptons projects. And he's obviously, familiar with the projects, but brings really a sort of artistic sensibility to the work.
You did not choose to include floor plans, which is somewhat unusual for an architecture book. And maybe that's that might be the only issue I might disagree with you on, in that really? You learned so much from a floor plan. Yeah. Why was that?
The real reason is a lot of our clients they were so gracious to let us publish the images, but so many of them are really very private.
Right.
And so there were some concerns with their floor plans being published and sort of broadcast to the world for security reasons and that kind of thing. But I'm really appreciative. Everyone kind of stepped up to the plate and let me publish their work. And I'm so profoundly appreciative because, without photographic record of the work, it's like it never happened, right? Especially with houses, because they're for private use. And so,
and today it gets harder and harder. People are more and more anxious about security and issues like that. And I know certainly there are many houses designed by distinguished architects for very prominent clients that never get published, that never get into books, that never get into magazines and so forth.
Yeah.
And
so, that was really the reason for the lack of plans.
Sure. But I mean, it's on the other hand, it also, as I said, the photography and the design go much farther than most books into actually really allowing you to vicariously experience the house.
Yeah, Paul, that's I'm so pleased that you made that comment and that observation. That is, you may not know it, but that's the biggest compliment you could give, because we talked about this. We said the problem with photographing architecture, as you well know, is that architecture is so experiential. It's about, you go in and you have to turn your head, and it's like music. It's processional. There's progression through it.
Right. You move through it in time, in real time.
Exactly.
And also light and all those things. Yes.
All those things, and the emotive experience that comes from all of that, and so to capture that in fixed images, first of all, is a big challenge. It's very hard to do. I have a lot of respect for very good architectural photographers.
Right.
And so we wanted to tell the story, and we worked with this brilliant young woman named Mimi Tang, who I just can't envision ever not working with. I think she's a total talent graphically. She really helped us steer the book and understood what we were trying to do. But we wanted to tell a narrative that felt experiential, and we talked about the book being. Let's not just look at this like it's a book. Let's look at it like it's a project, like it's an architectural project. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thrilled that you made that comment and that observation. That means a lot to me, because we did attempt to do that.
Well, your work is very very sensual. I mean, it is about feeling and experience and the texture of materials, and about solids and voids and spaces and light and all the things that good architecture is supposed to be about, actually, ideally. But many architecture books essentially expect you to take that on say-so and don't actually themselves as objects make you experience it. So, let me ask you, shift slightly. Nobu is a rare exception for you in that it's a public space, a restaurant, a commercial project. How much have you done that is not residential? The book is, of course, exclusively residences. And do you want to do more, or do you envision your practice going forward as sticking with residences and houses?
Yeah, great question. I jokingly say I would design a birdhouse or a gas station if somebody hired me.
Okay.
With open arms, because it's a different program. So, as we get older, it kind of keeps things more interesting when you have different programs to work with.
Right.
So Nobu and Soho House, the building adjacent to it, were the only two restaurant type buildings I did. What's now Soho House in Malibu was actually a restaurant it was designed for Wolfgang Puck. It was going to be a restaurant for Wolfgang, and he and I spent a year together, meeting every couple of weeks, and he kind of got cold feet at the end of the process and pulled out as the tenant. Larry Ellison is like the landlord, so to speak, and owns those properties. And so I was working for Larry, but doing a restaurant building for Wolfgang and for a sushi restaurant.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, Nobu, Mayor Tepper, who runs Nobu, didn't want to move across the street. He was in the Cross Creek Shopping Center.
Mm-hmm.
And this gorgeous guy named Richie Notar, who I just adore, used to be the managing partner of Nobu. And I had known him through Sandy for years in New York City. And I called Richie and I said, Richie, you got to talk to Mayor and convince him to move into Larry's building. Because if you don't, Larry's told me he's going to send me to Kyoto to hire the fanciest, best sushi chefs in the world, and it's going to put you out of business in Malibu. And so he finally came over. And, you know, now, of course, it's like the #1 grossing restaurant in America, and Mayor Tepper thinks it's the best idea he ever had.
Right, of course.
But anyway, so we did that, and I helped a little bit my dear friend, Peter Liu in Australia. The Australian house in the book is a house I did with a family in Australia, and I became very close with Peter Liu, and so I helped him with some shops. He owns Seed in Australia, which is a lifestyle brand, not unlike Ralph Lauren. Mm-hmm. And so I had a really enjoyable experience in the retail sector, working with Peter on sort of brand ID through architecture with Seed. And then I'm now doing, for the first time, a medical building, a 5-story hospital, private hospital here in LA, which is a super compelling, exciting project for me, because hospitals are the most depressing. You know, if you're not sick when you go in a hospital, you're sick after you get in there, because it's so, you know.
Yeah, totally. You know, you've anticipated what was going to be my next question, which was, as somebody who at one point toyed with becoming a doctor, have you ever been interested in designing a healthcare facility or medical facility?
Yeah, you know, for a long time, it's like, you know, every time you go to visit a loved one in the hospital, it's like, oh yeah, the lighting, and, you know, it makes you look green, and, you know, it's just terrible. And I'm talking, you know, nice hospitals, the nicest hospitals even. Yep. And so the healthcare system, healthcare architecture, which is really governed by OSHPAD, for obvious reasons, it's got to be highly regulated, because, you know, bacteria can't live on surfaces and stuff. But it's actually, there's more room to wiggle than you'd think, in terms of lighting, color, and in terms of creating spaces that feel more residential and warmer. So I look forward to showing you, next time I see you, I'll show you some images of what we're doing. I'm really excited about that. Mm-hmm. Kind of redefining the paradigm on medical hospital space, where it's not so depressing.
And that's a challenge that so far has defeated many good architects.
I know.
Have been brought in. Right. I mean, I.M. Pei did a whole wing of Mount Sinai Hospital in New York many years ago, and I get it's better than the old wings of it, but it's still not what you would hope for at all. Yeah. I know. So we're really dedicated to trying to do something that makes a difference. So we'll see. It's a private hospital. It's not public. So it's owned by the doctors. Okay. So this is not like a new version of Cedars-Sinai that you're doing. Okay.
Right. It's a private hospital there's a group of 3 or 4 doctors that are putting it together, who are all kind of experts in their field. And it'll be a private kind of high-end hospital, and they very much want to have it feel like a hospitality sort of environment and experience, rather than a, you know, strictly medical experience.
So it's more like Nobu than
more
like Nobu than Cedars-Sinai is the goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Where's it going to be?
It's near San Vicente and Wilshire in LA. Yeah.
Great. Good. Wonderful. What about on the East Coast? Is there anything else, now that you've done 2 projects with Sandy in the Hamptons, is there anything else in the East?
Yes, I'm working on some projects in Miami at the moment, residential, and and it looks like I'm about to start a project, I'm happy to say, out in the Hamptons in North Haven for a really lovely couple.
Oh, wonderful. Great.
Yeah, so that'll be a good excuse to spend time, in the Hamptons that I love so much. And of course, our beloved friends, Paul, Clifford, and
Right.
Nikki Donan, that we can't forget about, who live in the Hamptons. I'm helping Clifford with a little studio space, and so
That's great. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
That's wonderful. And the Amagansett farm was, I know, purchased recently. Is that in the hands of people who are taking good care of it as well?
Yes, yeah. That property, which I love so much, it was one of my first projects. I did it 21 years ago, and it's like, you're getting old when you go to look at a house that you did 21 years ago, and of course, all I can see are the things I would do differently.
Right.
But it was bought by this absolutely lovely couple, and I feel like it sort of returned to the family. It's so hard sometimes when the clients sell these things.
Yes. Good. We have some questions here, and let me ask everyone else or anyone else who wants to submit one, please do send it in through the chat channel, and we'll share it with Scott and Lyn. Let me start with this one. Scott, which project that you've done was the biggest surprise, where the final concept was very different from the initial concept, and what caused the changes?
Great question. Probably there was a project that's not in the book that was a beautiful, smaller Paul Williams house. Paul Williams, for those of you who don't know, is one of the great LA architects, and very early on, he was an influential architect in the 30s in LA, and was actually one of the first prominent Black architects.
Right.
And leaves a really rich, fabulous legacy for all the generations that have followed here in LA, which, by the way, sort of lacks a historical precedent because it's so new compared to the East Coast and certainly Europe. And so Paul Williams was this fabulous architect, and we were hired to do a house, and the client wanted, it was a smaller Paul Williams house, and it hadn't been particularly well cared for and was in a state of disrepair, and the client really wanted to tear it down. And so we were going to do, a modern, I use the word modern, house, and it was nominated for Conservancy protection shortly after. And so the surprise was that we weren't going to tear it down.
Right.
Yeah, we couldn't tear it down. And so I had this really warm, fun experience working with this fabulous bone structure and house that Paul had created. It was a little bit like, Paul, the one in the little cottage that was there in Amagansett.
Yeah, sure.
You know how there was a little teeny thing that was,
right.
And to me, that was just the spiritual seed, that needed to be fertilized and watered.
You wanted to do a larger, more elaborate house that did not violate the spirit of the original structure. Exactly.
And so we ended up having this very different journey with that project than we had started off thinking. And I love the project. I think it really
that's especially good because now you don't have to be remembered in history as the guy who tore down a Paul Williams house.
Totally.
Which would not have helped your reputation any.
Yeah.
So
No.
Just as well that all turned out, I would say.
I agree completely.
Actually, good. There's a related and equally interesting question. The houses in the book, of course, have all been built because that's all photography of extant things. They embody everything you and Paul say good architecture embodies. That's nice. What has caused you to turn down some commissions for houses? Have you turned some down? And if so, why?
Yeah, it's usually one of two reasons. It's either, there's only a finite amount of time, and time management becomes a constraint,
Sure.
Not surprisingly, right? And I'd rather have fewer projects that I can really
get
put
deeply
myself
involved
in.
in. Yeah.
And so we've got a pretty bespoke operation that doesn't, have a ton of people. I think between our Seattle office and LA office, there's a total of 20, 22 people, something like that.
I mean, you're not a factory churning out stuff
Yeah.
at high volume.
Yeah. And
Right.
I wish I had the skill set to be more, that and crank out more volume of high end, beautiful projects. But I don't.
Yeah, but there's a point at which if you did, you wouldn't. In other words, there's a certain kind of work that I think can't be done at high volume.
Yeah.
In the same way that, in the food industry, restaurant industry, if you're going to serve banquets for 1,000 people at the Beverly Hilton, then you're not going to be able to turn out the kind of food that gets 3 Michelin stars. There's certain things you just cannot produce at vast scale, I think. And certainly your houses require really intense involvement with the client.
Yeah, absolutely.
All residential architects who are any good become as involved with their clients as a therapist does, maybe more so.
Totally. I always say that for an architect, there's a fine line between being the gardener and a family member.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
You're somewhere in the middle, Yeah.
Yes. You're still an employee in the sense they write checks to you, but you have an intimate connection that the gardener doesn't.
Right.
That's absolutely right. But now
you're also a psychologist, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And you end up knowing intimate details about people that when you know what's in their closet and how many pairs of shoes they want to have, a lot about them. Yeah. But
the other
answer turned down houses because you didn't feel you would enjoy the relationship with the client?
Yeah. And I was just going to say, in answer to the participants' question, which is a great question, I feel like I always say I feel like I get compensated 3 ways. One is the money you get paid. The other is the creative quality of what you're allowed to do. Right. And the third is the quality of the relationship that you're servicing.
Yeah.
Because, as we get older, we realize the journey is finite and you want to spend it with people that you really enjoy having on the path with you. And some of my dearest, closest friends are former clients, that are like family. The guy who's marrying me and Kellen, we had to push back our wedding until next year. It's supposed to be this December. Is a former client who I did a house for 15 years ago.
That's
for
wonderful.
His wife. They're our best friends, and so that relationship component, I think, probably more with residential than other.
Oh, I think so. I think absolutely.
Yeah.
But you're lucky that you have enough potential clients to be able to make the choice of working with the people who you care about and you feel you can have a real relationship with, which is great.
Yeah.
That's one of the great luxuries of all.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. Sharing the path with the right folks.
Exactly. And that stimulates you further to do your best work, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to produce your best work for somebody you don't like or respect, no matter how big their checkbook is, I would think.
That's right.
So,
For sure.
There's another question. If this is the first volume in a series, are there subsequent books? How are they coming along? Are there projects that you want to include in future books? You envision continuing to go beyond this one? Yes,
I would love to do additional books. It takes a while, so don't expect it next year. But as Lyn will attest, we have quite a few projects in the pipeline. I think we have at the moment 4 international projects and 8 domestic projects active. And so hopefully we won't have to wait another 20 years. It'll be something shorter than that. And then hopefully we'll be able to, Paul, as you alluded to, branch out a little from just houses and explore some other programs.
Because the intellectual challenge of doing new stuff, I would think, is important to you.
Totally.
I mean, you don't, Another thing I like about this book is that it shows breadth and change within the various projects, and yet there also are common threads that unite them. In other words, they're not, you couldn't look at these 8 houses and think 8 different architects designed them. There are still things that mark your work that create a sense of continuity, and yet there's still a huge amount of variation and range within them as you respond to particular sites and programs and different people, different clients, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. Here's another question: what effects will COVID have on your future work?
That is a great question, and I think it's a very interesting subject that all of us in the business are thinking about, and all of us in the world are thinking about. How do we live, and what are the fundamental paradigm shifts that are going to resonate from this experience? And I think we've all, as a community, globally, come to the realization that the home is a very important place for not just the program of dwelling, but also now the program of working and the program of maintaining our health with fitness, spaces for exercise and all the components critical to having a balanced life. I think a lot of that really will resonate. One of my new clients, who I just adore, is one of the largest home builders in the country, and he was explaining the other day, we were together, and he was explaining how that fundamental shift is something that they're even thinking about in these companies that make 50 or 70,000 houses a year, and it's really going to affect, we think, the landscape of the American house and probably the world.
Well, that's going to be an interesting question, I think, because what that guy is doing is trying to bring these things into the mass market. I mean, most of the clients of the houses that you've done that are shown in this book all have workspaces, exercise spaces, all these other things, because they are large, elaborate houses.
Yeah.
Lots of square feet, done by people with substantial budgets, who could afford to do those things long before COVID, just because they were nice ideas, not necessities. And now we're facing really the much more difficult challenge of how do you make these things accessible,
right,
in smaller houses that are done on, tighter budgets, not for people of vast means doing bespoke houses.
Right.
And that's a tough challenge, really.
It is.
You're right.
Yeah.
I think even though none of us knows for sure what the long-term impact of COVID will be, we certainly know that it will have impact, and this will probably be a huge part of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we hope there's a way to find it. We have time for just one more, and it's somewhat related, but not directly to the COVID question, which is sustainability. How important is that to you? How do you incorporate that into your work?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. I don't think it's a choice that we really have any longer,
right,
in the world. We have to be realistic that we haven't been particularly good shepherds of our world, and we've kind of stuck our heads in the sand for our whole historical existence, and we can't really do that anymore. And so, looking at how we can first clean up a bit of the mess that perhaps we've made. That's one way that we can, in architecture, make a contribution in the right direction. And then the other is sustainability with energy, and looking at how the materials that we select need to, for example, the wood, which we use quite a bit, must come from managed forestry practices, and not just tear down old growth trees for the sake of our vanity.
Right.
And so I think it's a really critical thing that we all must embrace and take seriously.
Is that something that all of your clients agree with? And do you push them in that direction if they don't? For example, given that many of your houses are designed with very substantial budgets, there's certainly not always a concern when people have that kind of means about long-term expenses, or about whether you use local materials versus others and so forth. Do you try to educate your clients in that direction, even when there's not a financial incentive to do so?
Yeah, Paul, I haven't really had to.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something that, and I'm sure, this is just, it's not true of everybody that I would come across, but for the most part, my clients are all on board with this,
Right.
And they often will bring it up, and
Good.
which is fabulous,
Good.
So
that's encouraging.
yeah, absolutely.
Good. I think that's a wrap. We're just about out of time. We are.
Great. I can't believe an hour flew by. Thank you, everybody, for listening in out there. I hope we didn't put you to sleep, and hopefully you use this as an excuse to get in out of the heat. I hear you guys are having
No. This is
summer right.
Once again, Scott Mitchell houses an exceptionally beautiful book about exceptionally beautiful work. And I urge you all to, if you are not in a position to commission a Scott Mitchell house, you can at least buy the Scott Mitchell book.
Yes.
Experience it that way.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lyn, for putting everything together, including the book. Thank you, Scott and Lyn, both, for being here and for making this book happen.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you so much. And thank you to Bookhampton as well for hosting.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, Scott Mitchell Houses, we have links available to purchase in the chat box. Thank you, Scott, Lyn, and Paul, all for being here, and for all of you for joining us this late afternoon. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday and have a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care.